Okay, so welcome everyone. Today we're going to be going over the readings from John Locke, major political philosopher. And we've already done a decent amount of political philosophy so far this semester, but I really love the readings for today because I would say they hit somewhat closer to home in a sense than the previous political philosophy we've been reading, just because Locke was such a huge influence on the country we all live in today. In the words of one political scientist, John Locke had such a profound influence on Thomas Jefferson that he may be deemed an honorary founding father of the United States. He advocated for the natural equality of human beings, their natural rights to life, liberty, and property, and defined legitimate government in terms that Jefferson would later use in the Declaration of Independence. So hopefully, if you had a chance to do the reading for today, a lot of the terminology Locke uses will sound familiar because, I mean, some of the phrases and ideas appear verbatim in that founding document for the United States government. So kind of takeaways I hope we get for today, I'll go over quickly now, will be to start with Locke's concept of rights and how he derives them from what he terms the state of nature. So that's a concept we were introduced to last week with Montaigne, but Locke will explore it in a very different direction and make human beings in a state, his understanding of human beings in a state of nature, his basis for a theory of rights and for his whole theory of government. Key rights will turn out to be rights to self-preservation and a right to one's property. Second takeaway for today will be about Locke's understanding of how and why government forms and takes shape. So after depicting human beings in a state of nature, he'll explain just why it is that they entered into agreements to create governments. And along the way, he ends up advocating for what would be termed limited government. And then lastly, but maybe most importantly, takeaway for today will be Locke's description of the conditions for overthrowing government. What could justify that? His conditions for rebellion, and it will turn out to be the case for Locke that when government encroaches on those natural rights to self-preservation and to property, he argues that human beings have a right to rebel. So before I say anything specifically about Locke, I've already used the term a few times. Hopefully we'll get a better understanding of it in the course of class. That term is rights. So what does that word mean to you, right? Maybe another question relatedly could be, what are examples of rights? Or negatively, when is a right being violated? Okay, I see Mackenzie put in the chat, something you're entitled to. I think that's a great start to understanding what rights are. So Mackenzie or anyone else, can you think of an example of something that one is entitled to? You see it in movies, TV shows. Someone says their rights have been violated. So what kind of rights are at issue? Okay, Maya has a great one. Life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, she wrote in the text. Yes, that comes straight from Locke. And this phrasing is, of course, in the Declaration of Independence of Thomas Jefferson, asserting that all men, in his phrasing, have rights to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. So what would be, so because we want to approach this philosophically, what would make someone say that all men or all human beings have rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness? Okay, I like what Edwin put in the chat. Could it be related to virtue as a form of what is correct and acceptable? I mean, I love the idea of trying to bridge that idea of virtue we were talking about at the start of the semester to this more modern idea about rights. I mean, that would be, you could write a whole book on that topic. Um, do virtuous people have rights others do not? Or if we want to say everyone has rights, is virtue key to sort of activating them? I mean, there are a lot of different ways you could try to make connections between virtue and rights. I think one thing that one the examples that came to mind for me, before class, where if you think about sort of the biggest movements that you've seen in the headlines the past few years, um, the protests and the movement for police reform after the killing of George Floyd and the Me Too movement, I think both of those could be understood in terms of rights. I'm sure everyone remembers the George Floyd protests. They weren't that long ago. I mean, you see thousands of New Yorkers taking to the streets. You see hundreds of thousands of people across the country. I think that movement could be understood in terms of rights. There was an idea that the killing of George Floyd marked a violation of right and somehow revealed widespread so-called systemic violations of rights in the way police conduct themselves in relation to their communities. Similarly with the Me Too movement, okay, so that started with a monstrous Hollywood producer, Harvey Weinstein, found guilty of serious crimes, but the movement that his exposure sparked kind of triggered this sense that women's rights in particular were constantly being violated. So we could ask ourselves, what rights are at issue in each of those two examples? Right not to be killed or abused or harassed by police on the one hand, a right to be free from harassment in the workplace on the other hand. But from a philosophical perspective, we should be asking ourselves, I mean, I'm inclined to agree with the sort of missions of both of those movements, but from a philosophical perspective, we could ask ourselves, what do we base a conception of those rights on? Is it we if you want to advance those ideas, those kinds of ideas of rights, you should have a good argument for them, a good defense of them. So that's kind of a preamble for now. I think with that, I'll fire up the slides and get back to Locke. So hopefully everyone can see the slides. Tell me if you can't. But Locke lived in a time before the founding of the United States, some decades before, of great civil conflict in his native England. And he, among many other things, he wrote on topics including epistemology, the philosophical study of what can and cannot be known. He wrote about metaphysics. He was a major philosopher who also advanced for religious toleration. But he had to be cautious in pursuing that mission, as he was cautious with his political writings, because he was living in a very dangerous time. And I think one of the challenges to kind of unpacking the meaning of Locke's political thought and appreciating its significance today is, just the fact that what he wrote is so much a part of the status quo and how I think a lot of people understand themselves and contemporary society. But in his own time, his thoughts would have been considered extremely radical, a major departure from the status quo. And that comes up in what's called Locke's first treatise of government. So the readings for today come from his far more famous second treatise, but it's in the first one that he goes on an attack against a kind of representative of the much more predominant views from his time. And that representative is a philosopher not very much thought about or remembered nowadays, called Sir Robert Filmer. And his vision of government, again, would have been the one that people with power tended to agree with. So this is a time before, kind of democracy has swept large swaths of the earth, and monarchy is the name of the game. So Filmer advocates a point of view that justifies absolute monarchy. You can think of kings, some queens, but more often kings, with absolute power of life and death over their subjects and their subjects' property, maybe varying depending on the specific country, time, and climate that they live in. But that would be the core idea, according to Sir Robert Filmer, or his core conception of what monarchy is. And he would argue for that view by basing it on something called divine right, and trying to chart out the connection between the earthly powers of monarchs and God in the heavens above, saying that the absolute power of life and death of the King of England, for example, somehow comes from God himself. And Robert Filmer includes some somewhat convoluted biblical analysis trying to show how, just as God endowed Adam with dominion over everything, including Eve, kings also have dominion over their subjects. So a somewhat convoluted argument, and one that probably would strike us as strange today, I think. But that would be a status quo view from Locke's time. Part of that view also entails a view of subjects of an absolute monarch as being fundamentally unfree. No one is born with freedom. In the divine system, according to Robert Filmer and many others, the monarch is unquestioningly in power, and his subjects have to do what they say. So Locke, in the second treatise, will, after attacking Robert Filmer's views explicitly in the first one, advances a radically different vision of government, one that is not based on absolute power and divine right, but it is limited in scope. And also a key concept for Locke is that instead of viewing government as viewing the world really as one in which human beings are born unfree and effectively have to do what the monarch tells them to, Locke will insist that government only exists through the consent of the governed. So a very radical new idea. And in contrast to a Filmer-esque view in which human beings are born unfree, Locke will argue that we are, in fact, born free. So a key question of both that hopefully is starting to become clear is that the source of authority in government has to be understood. So someone like Robert Filmer or other thinkers in the 17th century pre-democratic world will say authority in government ultimately derives from God. So if you want to argue against that, you need to come up with an alternate source of authority. So that would be one major focus of Locke's second treatise on government. And he goes about searching for this concept of what legitimizes government by imagining human beings in the condition before government. So Locke thinks that it's important to understand what human beings were like in a hypothetical condition before government even existed. So you think that will be the place to look to really understand human beings at their essence and how and why it is that they created governments in the first place. Because I have to think, even if you live in a time before democracies existed, before there was any sophisticated conception of civic participation in society, you have to be aware that government is fundamentally a human creation. It hasn't always been around. So there's something very like reasonable to me about looking to a pre-government state to try to understand the way human beings conduct themselves and create governments today. But we also might keep in the back of our minds what kind of assumptions is Locke or arise from Locke in his treatment of human beings when he is writing about the so-called state of nature. And we're under no obligation to agree with anything that he said, but if we think that it's important to establish rights that human beings have, I think we would hope that he makes a strong defense of what human beings are like in a state of nature. And if not, if he's wrong on some level about what humans are like in a state of nature, does that undermine his idea of rights that seems so key to government in the US and many other countries today? Does he have blind spots in his discussion of the state of nature? So at any rate, Locke tries to imagine, this was at the very beginning of the readings for today, human beings with no government, and how do they act toward one another? And Locke pretty quickly states that life in a state of nature is both a state of freedom and a state of equality. Can someone maybe read from the second bullet point, not all of the bullet point, but the quotation, or just before the quotation, starting with "because there is"? Okay, Tangina, I see your hand raised. Go for it.
Could you point where the because there is? It's the second one you're talking about, right?
Oh,
Okay.
there's sort of.
Because there is nothing more evident than that creatures of the same species and rank, promiscuously born to all the same advantages of nature and the use of the same facilities, should also be equal one amongst another without subordination or subjection.
Okay, thank you, Tangina. So this might ring a bell from the Declaration of Independence, but this is Locke's assessment of humans where government exists. That all humans are created equal. Is he right?
Depends by equal.
Well, let's look at some of the terminology that he's using here. Creatures of the same species and rank, promiscuously born to all the same advantages of nature and the use of the same faculties. So that's his framing for this equality. Okay, so species, he's talking about Homo sapiens. Same advantages of nature and the same faculties. So what might be examples of the faculties he's talking about?
I guess born in a hospital.
Okay, yeah. But I mean, not everyone's born in a hospital.
Yeah, but that would be like one, I guess, critique of, I guess, that way of thinking.
Yeah, I think that's so. My read when he's talking about faculties are things like just fundamental capacities, like
Yeah.
bodily strength,
Mm-hmm.
intelligence, things like that. And sure, like when you're further advanced in civilization, use of facilities like a hospital or not might come into play. But I think he's looking at humans on a very fundamental level and saying, in terms of things like strength and intelligence, we are born equal. So I see another hand raised. Sam, please.
Yeah, I think it's kind of the idea of like everyone is born the same, and then with like education and practice that we can reach different levels of ability. It's very similar to like Plato's Republic, saying like, you know, we're all born the same, and education can turn us into different kinds of people.
Yes, I love the connection to Plato. But I'm going to hold back from going on a long digression about equality in the Republic, because I think you're right that the Republic has a certain, in the ideal city of the Republic, there is a presupposition of a certain level of equality, at least when citizens are children. And that education, yes, you recall the pyramid that we went over. But yeah, the Republic becomes totally, members become totally unequal by and during education. But I'm curious, if you're an educator yourself, so are humans, do we come into the world equal?
No.
Okay, I'm hearing a strong no. Why no?
Because some people are literally, well, just on the basis of some people could just be born with, you know, like oh, what's it called? Like they could just be uh, they can like have some stillbirths, some could just have like disabilities.
Yeah.
Like just on the basis of that, you can just clearly just be like no, and some people could just, I don't know, aren't like afforded to like actually, well, they could be born, but they can't actually like be afforded to grow up in an actual environment that actually cares for them.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think that's a great point. I mean, you see examples constantly, some heartbreaking examples that seem to suggest we are not born equal. So Sam, I see your hand raised, please.
Yeah, I mean, I think this touches upon what we were talking about before with like very recent political conversations surrounding like, you know, Black Lives Matter, and, you know, like trans lives matter, and, you know, even like stemming back to like the AIDS epidemic and other epidemics and topics that have happened before. I think it's really important to touch upon the fact that certain people, I think what um Alan, I don't know, I don't want to mispronounce your name,
Yeah,
but
Alan,
Alan
yeah.
Elaine.
No, you got it right.
Okay, great. So Alan was kind of touching upon like being born with like a certain privilege. I think people can be born with like financial privilege or racial privilege, or, you know, like, you know, I think being born disabled is a lack of privilege. And everyone has different levels of privilege. So I think to say that everybody is born on the same level, I think does have inherent flaw. And I think that this is just coming from a place where philosophy was literally just like conversations being had between a bunch of white men.
Yes.
So all of them were kind of already like the same. All of them were already like financially stable enough. A lot of them were probably like not experiencing levels of like complex intersectional identities. So I think that that's a huge flaw of this, where it's like, yeah, I mean, if you were all born with the same status and privilege, which is very high status and very high privilege, then you probably do believe that any of the achievements you have are through hard work, that you're like, I worked really hard to make it where I am, and everybody's born equal, and I, you know, those who are just and virtuous can work harder and earn things versus those who are unjust are punished, when really it's like not breaking down the complexities of like, well, why do people do unjust things, and what can lead someone to being in a position of making an unjust decision, and what exactly is the idea of justness based on, especially when a lot of these political and philosophical conversations tend to center like white men. It's like, well, our idea of virtue and justness is like white men.
Sure. Yeah,
so yeah,
absolutely.
a lot of people fall through the cracks there.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you've hit on exactly a major criticism that you'd find in like contemporary political philosophy of Locke, which is, you know, he talks about, I mean, first of all, the vocabulary is all men. And when a Locke apologist would say, okay, you can expand it to all of humanity, but even still, that is arguably a giveaway that he is very much writing from the perspective of a very powerful segment of society, white male property owners, and as a result, there's a amount of bias, even assuming Locke is supremely well intentioned, that is just built into his perspective. So I guess the question for us becomes, if we want to kind of keep Locke's project, which I think is a worthwhile one, of establishing human rights, do his blind spots undermine or cripple his justification for rights to things like life, health, liberty, and possessions, or do we have to take another tack to establish those things? So yeah, I see. Please.
Oh, so
Oh.
is that a question you wanted to answer?
Yeah, I
Open-ended
was.
question, but yeah, Sam, I saw your hand raised. So yeah, Sam, then
Right.
Alan,
Yeah,
please.
I just had a question that's like a logistical question. I was wondering, like, because I'm not like a history buff or anything. What percentage of people could read during this period? Like,
Great
who
question.
exactly had access to these conversations and who had access to like education, basically, and like what
Yeah,
he's saying, like the laws of reason and
sure.
health, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, and all of that. Like, how many people could access these texts
So
and like talk about them?
as for the second treatise itself, I believe it was not published in his lifetime. I might be wrong about that because it was so dangerous and basically was an argument for overthrowing a monarchy. So I don't think he had it published in his lifetime. And I'm not even sure how widely circulated it was when he was alive, because he, being this Oxford anchored intellectual who was also politically active. So it's really like the cream of society at the time that he's operating in. But also, if someone were to get their hands on his subversive thoughts and expose him, he could literally be executed. So the text itself, I think it took some time to sort of circulate more widely. As far as the audience goes, I mean, that's a great question. I don't have any specifics on like literacy in the UK or the US colonies at the time. I think, when I've come across history before, I feel like it's higher than one might think. Okay, so Shakespeare's London was actually like quite literate. I gather from reading a biography of Shakespeare, this is actually not that long after Shakespeare died. So my guess is, this would be a really unsatisfying answer, but lower literacy levels than today in the UK or the US, but not as low as one might think. So Alan, did you want to chime in?
Yeah, it was sort of I guess, answer the question you sort of proposed, but it was like, my like way of thinking about it is that like you could like in some sense like make like a framework for like a government like regarding like those sort of things, but after a while that it just becomes sort of useless. Like, take our amendments for example. Like, sure, they're like useful, but as like advanced we get, they're kind of dumb when you think about it because they're not really relevant.
So what is not relevant?
Well, not necessarily relevant, but like they don't really take into account for a lot of things.
Sure. Yeah,
Like
absolutely.
like the Second Amendment or something. You can't really, if you were to go back in time with like a modern day gun to like when the founding fathers, they'll just be like, "What the hell is that?
Yeah.
Like, what are you showing me right now?"
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I tend to think, an apologist for the US Constitution would state that it's a work in progress, which is why amendments exist. And yeah, I mean, to pick the Second Amendment in particular, I mean, that would be very linked with Locke's idea of natural right to one's life and one's property. The idea being that, an extension of that includes the right to bear arms and protect yourself. But if it turns out centuries later that arms turn out to be mass killing machines, that would also, seem to be a major problem and a flaw with the Second Amendment. So an apologist would say, if for either the Constitution or for Locke, would say that the conceptions of rights are not exhaustive and they have flaws, but can be improved. So I guess the question for us would be, what exactly are the flaws? And do we agree that they could be improved, or do you just have to toss the project out and start right over? Because in a few weeks, we're going to get exposure to a thinker who will say, burn the whole thing down, and that's Marx. But I think for now, just sticking to like this very fundamental level that Locke has tried to talk about. I mean, I love the fact that flaws in his view of humans in a state of nature have already come up. But if we want to stick with him a little bit, and maybe let's concede for now that humans are born in a state of equality with one another. And what might be the case here is that Locke would be, let's assume that he was aware that humans have different levels of strength and intelligence. Okay, so he's like one of the most educated members of his own society. He has to be aware that not everyone goes to Oxford and becomes capable of writing genius philosophy. Maybe he has in mind that the differences in human beings are small enough, whether the differences between being a farmer who maybe can or cannot read compared to a university graduate, they're small enough that people are effectively equal. They're equal in the important parts. There's a smaller difference between John Locke and a farmer than there is between John Locke and a parrot. He's talking about on the level of species, humans are equal. So and that for him is the basis of the most fundamental right, looking at the third bullet point, which he'll end up describing as a law of reason, that no one ought to harm another in his life, health, liberty, or possessions, and being furnished with like faculties, similar enough intelligence, similar enough strength, sharing all in one community of nature, there cannot be supposed any such subordination among us that may authorize one to destroy another. So maybe one paraphrase is that because people are equal in the important respects, there can never be a justification for someone to harm another in respect of life and possessions. And the way he frames that is, it's a law of reason. It is self-evident that because we are equal, it follows from the fact of equality that we cannot do harm to one another. So, I mean, I think both sides of the equation are really important to and potential, we have to ask, what are the weak points here? We've already talked about weak points with his idea of equality, but if we're willing to entertain it, we can look at the other side of the equation, that because of this equality, everyone has a right to life, health, liberty, and possessions. Locke is saying, in fact, it's a law of reason, because one cannot help but, it's not in this slide, but it's in the text, no one has the capacity not to basically effectively fight for their self-preservation. So the way of phrasing it would be, what people cannot help but do, they have a right to that thing. So this would be, to me, it's a hugely important point. It's probably the most important point in Locke. Does he successfully argue that all human beings have a right to, I mean, it's just several different framings of it. The one here is life, health, liberty, or possessions. You could condense it to self-preservation and property. Like, that is the key right, I think, according to Locke, and also for contemporary ideas of human rights. I mean, I think most other rights that come up for discussion today could be linked to this core right, to one's life and one's possessions, or even if you don't care about possessions, if you're a communist, and I don't mean that flippantly, because there's serious arguments to be made for radical forms of government. You could keep it to just the first right, to self-preservation, to your life, health, and health. So is Locke successfully arguing it? Yes, Maya, I see your hand raised.
I think I think I do like this sort of idea of everyone of sort of everyone's having the same rights and that coming from equality, but I don't know that I really. It seems like he's saying that this is a fact because this is how we would be without any government, or this is how we would be naturally, or I guess in a state of nature. This is how we kind of are deep down. And that doesn't seem, I mean, I think it's something to aspire to and maybe something that government should be built on. But it doesn't seem like he's really shown that this is necessarily something that we are naturally.
Yeah. I mean, you could look. So I mean, it's the whole idea of the state of nature is actually a tricky concept to me, because it seems like a hypothetical on the one hand, but on the other, I mean, surely there was a time in prehistory that government didn't exist. So the more I think about it, the less I have a firm sense of what Locke's state of nature is. But sort of in the vein of what you're talking about, Maya, one would think you could interpret nature in a completely different way and state that it's not a state of peace. That's another characterization Locke makes of the state of nature. It's actually a state of war. And there is another major political philosopher not on our syllabus, Thomas Hobbes, who says something to that effect. The famous quote being, life in a state of nature is nasty, brutish, and short. Moreover, in terms of this issue of equality that we've been talking about, you could look to or try to imagine human beings in pre-government condition and find seemingly endless examples of inequality and domination. I mean, Aristotle seemed to think that humans were not born equal, but that they were. This is something we didn't talk about too much during our class on Aristotle's Politics, but he does seem to hold a view that that master-slave relations are part of the state of nature and the state of government also. So yeah, there's lots of different possible ideas about what the human essence is, or in this framing, what the state of nature is. So again, the question for us will be, who, if any, of these major philosophers is right? I mean, I want to agree with Locke. I mean, I'll say my own view. Like, I want to agree with Locke. You can sort of correct for the biases he had as a white man in the kind of upper crust of his society. Okay, you could. I think it's possible to expand, his limited view and basically modify his main theses. But there's major problems with his idea of the state of nature, even still, just conceptually. So we'll see how Locke stands by the end of class. And actually, I want to move on eventually, because what we're working up to is going to be Locke's justification for rebellion after the state of nature and when government has arisen. So I don't think I need to say too much more about this concept of self-preservation, but other than just to reiterate that for Locke, it appears to be the fundamental right, along with property, that a law of reason is one human being cannot infringe that core right that others have. Everyone, as he is bound to preserve himself and not quit his station willfully. There's a parenthetical that he thinks that the law of reason rules out suicide, as a side note. By the like reason, when his own preservation comes not in competition, ought he, as much as he can, to preserve the rest of mankind, and may not, unless it be to do justice on an offender, take away or impair the life, or what tends to the preservation of the life, liberty, health, limb, or goods of another. So that is the core basis. So this is humanity in a state of nature, but it's also the basis for civil society, according to Locke. And I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but an important topic for Locke is how human beings transition from a state of nature to living in government with one another. And the sort of crux of that transition is property and the need to preserve it. So another formulation of that right to self-preservation and property is that people are entitled to the fruit of their labor as long as they're not depriving someone else. Eventually, as this hypothetical state of nature progresses, money comes onto the scene and allows people to acquire goods and expand property. And it passes without comment from Locke. I mean, there's no criticism from Locke of inequality that will be found in this hypothetical pre-state of government, yet developed enough state of nature that there's money and inequality. Locke will not criticize that. In fact, he'll seem to suggest that some inequality is good for humanity, because if there's one wealthy farmer, that inevitably, according to Locke, would help everyone. And Locke will also contend that the poorest person in a society that has money is still better off than the richest person in a state of nature. So he seems to be fine with levels of economic inequality, but it goes without saying that that issue is one of the main problems that people in politics talk about today. But as economics develop, Locke basically states that human beings exit a state of nature and form governments out of a need to protect their property. That is the key reason that he says government arises. And either love or hate the 17th century terminology in terms of phrase from Locke, his phrasing is, the possessions of the industrious and rational must be protected from the fancy or covetousness, the desire to attain the possessions, from the quarrelsome and contentious. So to reiterate, Locke's phrasing for property and protecting property being the basis for forming governments is, the great and chief end of men's uniting into commonwealths and putting themselves under government is the preservation of their property. Property turns out to be unsafe in a state of nature, even though Locke is describing it as a state of equality, a state of peace, because there is no established law, there is no judge with authority to determine the differences according to that law, and there's no power to back and support a sentence and give it due execution. AKA, these are the legislative, judicial, and executive branches. In the state of nature, people, according to Locke, had a right to essentially extract vengeance or right wrongs that are made against them. But as wealth advances, as wealth grows, as commerce happens, Locke states that suggests that it is just impossible for individuals to essentially take matters into their own hands whenever there's an infringement of one's right to property. And that is the reason why they exit the state of nature and create government. Okay, and the specific framing is they agree to transfer the powers they had in a state of nature, the power to protect their life and property and to punish those who harm them, they sort of give up that power to the government. This has already come up, and I love the fact that we've touched on some seeming blind spots that Locke has. But I just want to mention in passing now that if a thinker makes protection of property the foundation of what government is, it's going to create all kinds of assumptions about the shape that government, or it's going to have all kinds of effects on the shape that government takes. So just something to keep in the back of mind is if Locke or another thinker had a different emphasis than protection of property for their idea of why government arises, what effect would that have on the government that finally takes shape? But we can see how this is part of why Locke is considered an advocate of limited government. Government isn't intended, in Locke's view, to actively necessarily do things to help members. It's more to kind of create conditions of restraint and leave individuals to themselves, it seems. So I was starting to say, the state of nature, human beings have two key powers, and it's in the state of government that they completely lose one of them, and mostly, but crucially not entirely, transfer the other. So the power that is completely given up when human beings, according to Locke, exit a state of nature and form government is to punish the crimes committed against them. You can no longer be your own judge, jury, and executioner, which Locke thought you had the right to do in the state of nature. This is a key part of formation of government, is it's now government that takes that task upon itself. I mean, relatedly, the power to do whatever one thinks fit for the preservation of himself and others is mostly transferred from the individual to the government. But Locke will contend, I think, in keeping with his idea that human beings cannot act otherwise than to preserve themselves. Even once government has been established, they are incapable, in a sense, of giving up this first right, this power to do what one thinks fit for the preservation of oneself. And this will be the seed of Locke's justification for rebelling against one's own government. I want to note that neither in the reading for today, which were relatively short selections from the second treatise, nor anywhere else in that work did Locke make a specific preference for democracy or any other form of government. He does depict government as being a product of majority rule. Human beings have to come together in agreement to create government for the first time, and that will be agreement by the majority. But he's already depicting governmental power as being relatively limited. One way to interpret some of Locke is that he insists being subject to an overpowering, arbitrary government, an absolute monarchy, would be worse than being in a state of nature. Why would people exit a state of nature only to involuntarily enter a government where they were less secure about their lives, health, and property? So because human beings, according to Locke, can never fully give up their power to do what they deem fit for their self-preservation, in extreme conditions, according to Locke, they will be justified in rebelling against their government. And the key condition for Locke for rebellion is when the rulers in government advance their own interests over those of society and are no longer serving to preserve and protect the lives and possessions of their subjects, but are now working against those priorities. And for Locke, a key sign of that will be when a government uses force against its own people. In those kind of crisis conditions, Locke argues that the ruling powers in government have effectively lost their legitimacy and reverted the society where they work back to a state of nature. So there's those original powers to kind of judge and execute one's rights over their bodies and their property are completely restored in this kind of condition of crisis, according to Locke. So just to recap a little bit, it was human beings' desire to preserve themselves that led to the creation of government. But there's also within society always kind of this threat that they'll encounter a greater danger, that of a tyrannical government that advances its own interests over members of society and maybe even uses force against members of society. So self-preservation in this context is the greatest desire that people have, and it's also their strongest defense. And in this worldview, politics will appear to be the struggle to climb out of the state of nature and avoid falling back into it. So that you could start to see how at the very beginning I was saying that Locke could almost be considered an honorary founder of the US form of government. So hopefully it's this last kind of theme from Locke, what justifies rebellion? It gives a sense of why that is. And we could think of the Declaration of Independence, which I'm sure we all encountered probably in high school civics, middle school government class, that begins with an enunciation of human rights, but then quickly launches into the famous list of grievances against the king, instances of government, a monarch, advancing its own interest allegedly over those of society, using force even against members of society. So my question, should be very interested to hear what you think before we go. Is this a good defense of rebellion? And there's a lot of related questions one could ask. I mean, I think even if it's not a good defense of rebellion, it suggests to me that any effective government should acknowledge possible conditions under which rebellion happens. I mean, we could go back to what Alan was saying at the beginning, that the amendments seem to suggest, I mean, my interpretation of what Alan was saying, the amendments seem to suggest problems, flaws, oversights in the formation of the government we live in today. So how do we know how do we draw a line between what should be amended and what should be overthrown or rebelled against? And did Locke give a good way to make that distinction?
Well, it's sort of like tangential, but just like, was Locke like the proto-libertarian or something?
I think it's one way to think about him.
Yeah, because
I mean,
a lot of his way of thinking just screams like I'm like a libertarian or something.
Yeah, I mean libertarianism comes on the scene a little bit later. I mean, Locke is considered the original liberal political philosopher. Again, with thinking of his context where rival views are going to be largely defenses of monarchy. So what makes him a liberal. I think it's a different sense of the word than we encounter it today. I mean, it's not left or right in politics, but I mean, it entails things like acknowledgement of basic human rights and building a restricted, limited government on those rights. And it's the latter thing that makes him sound libertarian to me also. But I think Locke is a liberal who can be interpreted in a very libertarian way, but he doesn't have to be, because I think historically, in the centuries after Locke, his idea of right has been interpreted both in a restricted libertarian sense, like don't tread on me, government should be small, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But there are people who can read Locke and find a case for a much more expansive government. I mean, those fundamental rights to self-preservation and property have grown into a very long list of rights. So I think, he doesn't have to be interpreted in a libertarian way. It would be very much subject to different opinions. Evelyn, I see your hand raised.
So I think when you get to choose, okay, so we have a democracy, right? So we get to vote and choose the person that's gonna go into position. And I think the moment they start doing their job, or they start representing the people that chose them, I think that's exactly when they're supposed to visualize and realize that they're doing something that they're not supposed to be doing. And in some way, this is the thing about politicians, that they speak a lot and they promise a lot. But when they go into position, things change dramatically. Those policies and all the things that they said that we're gonna do, for some reason, just is out of the table. And
Right.
And then if people choose you to represent them, and then you don't do that, you don't do exactly, it's like choosing for a position at work and you're not doing your job, you're gonna be kicked out of there. So I think that should be exactly what government should be doing. So if our government leaders get angry because there's people protesting out there, that's a representation of you not doing your job.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, you've touched on the reason why Locke is considered a basis for a democratic form of government instead of a monarchy. I mean, we were saying a few minutes ago that the text does not directly state what form of government should be established once people leave the state of nature, but it sounds very much like a basis for democracy compared to other forms of governments, in which the ruling class is not installed for life, and that they can be voted, vote the bums out. But I think the question Locke raises is, is there, if those with power as a class consistently fail to deliver on what they promised, can that reach such a point of crisis that an actual rebellion, in the sense of dissolving a government, is justifiable? I mean, you can look at the Senate, right? I mean, the House has a higher turnover than the Senate, short 2-year terms, constant rotation of incumbents, but we have senators who are effectively installed for life. And if we think that they're not living up to their responsibilities, is there a point at which we say that the Senate should be ended?
I think we're already going through that right now, and the amount of distrust from the American people toward the government is literally breaking apart, and setting a turmoil within our own nation. And the fact that our politicians do not see that is quite scary.
But how would Locke justify overthrowing the US Congress or the president?
I mean, like you said, so he believed in a smaller government, and that's the thing though with our government, that is too big. I think it's too big at the same time, and it's really hard because every state has their own laws. It has created their own, we have the federal, the state taxes. We have to like so much that is really hard to just say this way is gonna work for everybody. So it's really hard if you think about it.
Yeah, I think to try to use Locke's terms and to wind down, I mean, a contemporary rebellion would be justified if the rulers advance their own interests over society and even use force against their own people. I mean, are we at the point where, to again use Locke's terms, the ruling class have created a state of nature between themselves and everyday people? That's an open question.
I don't think I share anything in common with the people in Congress right now, to be honest with you.
Right. Yeah, I mean, that's a very widespread complaint. But again, I mean, how are we? It's a serious question to me. How do we tell when things have gotten so bad that an actual rebellion is justified? Because again, the U.S. has, and by rebellion it means like ending government. The reason against that would start to be, and there's reasons for. I mean, I think Locke gives a case of reasons for. I mean, reasons against that would start to be that the U.S. does have the longest functioning constitution in the world, would start to suggest that it's had staying power, and there's a reason why, and that there are built-in mechanisms for correcting the sort of alienation that we're talking about. But definitely don't take my word for it, because as with everything, we should. Everything Locke says is perfectly debatable, and certainly all my interpretations don't want to have the last word on any of it. So yeah, maybe anyone care to make a defense of the government right now, though, or don't agree or disagree? Are we at a point of rebellion?
Do you consider that what happened, the Capitol storming, a rebellion that happened on January?
That's a good question. But I mean, it shows. I'm not going to go. I'm not going to defend.
I'm just saying because the idea of that doing came from the person that was in charge. So I'm just confused here. How like politicians can put people against each other and then create a chaos, and then having so much chaos that people don't know where to go.
Yeah. So it was termed an insurrection by the Congress that impeached the president over it. And that sounds right to me. But I mean, from Locke's, if we applied Locke to it, the people who rioted on January 6th did say that they were executing a rebellion in something like Locke's terms, which is that the government, specifically the Congress, had advanced its own interests over them and ended their legitimacy. So I don't agree with what happened on January 6, 2021, but I think those who participated in it actually said they were doing something in the tradition of the original rebellion in the US. So to try to bring Locke back into it, I mean, I think he does give a good lens to evaluate the claims that were made on January 6. Did Congress do what those who rioted in the Congress said it did, which is, again, advance its own interests over those of the rioters and create a state of nature and lose their legitimacy? I think that's a great question to wind down our discussion of Locke on. And I mean, honestly, it shows to me that really more so maybe than anyone else we're going to see this semester, that his thoughts are extremely relevant to things happening today.